Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar from Risk-Based Security. It is great to have you here, and I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and well in this difficult time. My name is Brendan Dodds. I'm a director here at Risk-Based Security, and I'm going to be your host for today. And over the next 30 minutes, we'll be digging into the latest statistics on the vulnerability landscape based on updated data from the first half of 2020. We will be sharing some of the issues and the trends that we're seeing in the vulnerability data and attempting to put those into the context of our fast-changing world. We have commentary, charts, and statistics to share with you, but just before we get into all of that, just a couple of housekeeping notes to share so we can get the most out of today's session. So the recording of today's session will be made available on BrightTALK and on our website, so do bookmark this link. Do share it with your friends and colleagues who might find it interesting or useful. This is part of an ongoing series of webinars focused on the latest trends and issues in data breaches and vulnerabilities, and we don't want you to miss out, so please take a moment to subscribe to the Risk-Based Security channel on BrightTALK. Well, we like to hear from you. We want your questions, so please challenge us, post them in the box provided. We will address some of them as we go, and we will pause for Q&A at the end of the session. And your questions are anonymous, so if you do want to be acknowledged by name, you do need to include your name in the question itself. If you are watching the replay, or if you need to get in touch with us for any other reason, you can always do so via the contact page on our website at riskbasedsecurity.com. Well, the analysis you're going to hear today is based on our 2020 mid-year vulnerability quick view reports, which is available to you to download at no cost. Webinar registrants can grab it from the content section right here on BrightTALK. And if you're watching the replay or you can't see it for any reason, you can always find that report and further analysis on emerging vulnerability trends on our website, riskbasedsecurity.com. And while you're there, check out a full archive of all our previous reports showing the history of vulnerability trends and our observations over a number of years. Well, as I said, my name is Brendan Dodds, but it is time to introduce you to our presenter for today's session. Brian Martin is the Vice President of Vulnerability Intelligence here at Risk-Based Security and has been studying, collecting, and cataloging vulnerabilities like a squirrel with nuts since 1993, both personally and professionally. Some would say, Brian, obsessively, I think. He was the content manager of the open source vulnerability database, that's OSVDB, and he's been pushing for the evolution and improvement in processes and coverage of vulnerability databases for many years, none more so than the one he currently manages, VulnDB. Brian's been involved in all aspects of the vulnerability disclosure process. He was on the CD editorial board for 10 years and is a highly sought after speaker at conferences and events. And it is my pleasure to hand you over to Brian, who's going to take us through today's briefing. Brian.
Thank you, Brendan. Hello, everyone. Thanks for hanging out with us today. As you can tell from my profile picture, the pandemic is driving a lot of us crazy, myself included. Anyway, I'm going to jump right into things. So in January, we published a blog warning about the upcoming vulnerability Fujiwara. It's a term we adopted for the collision of Oracle and Microsoft patches on the same Patch Tuesday. We made noise over this event this year because it happened 3 different times. As you can see, January, April, and July. The last time it happened was in 2015, and the next time it will happen is in 2025. So they are fairly rare, and to have 3 in 1 year is considerable. When Oracle releases, it's typically a week after Patch Tuesday. That week isn't exactly a long period, but it does give administrators some much needed time between dealing with patching between Microsoft and Oracle, for example. So a vulnerability Fujiwara event stacks all of that in a single day. At least that's how it used to be. The last Fujiwara event for this year, which happened after the reporting period, saw prominent vendors release a day after as well. So July 14 was bad enough with Microsoft and Oracle, which also included the SIG-RED vulnerability. But to make it worse, Cisco released 31 advisories on the 15th, and Apple released 27 iOS advisories that day as well. So what that means is that basically Patch Tuesday has really extended to almost a 48-hour period, which puts an incredible burden on IT staff. So what did this look like for the 3 events? Here we have a breakdown of the numbers. We can see that Microsoft actually had a significantly smaller number than normal in January, but returned to a more typical volume. in April and July. For Oracle, astute vulnerability nerds may notice that the numbers seem a little low, and that's because this reflects the amount of new vulnerabilities disclosed that day, not all vulnerabilities that they patched. We'll talk about that more in just a bit. So those same nerds may also notice that Adobe is down considerably and that SAP, while a big name, aren't releasing that many vulnerabilities each time. Adding the rest of the vendors to the Patch Tuesday, we can see that combined they represent the same volume as Microsoft does by themselves. All said and done, April's event saw the highest numbers coming in at 506. Again, that represents newly disclosed vulnerabilities. For administrators, that picture is actually worse. Many of us are familiar with the pre-release announcements from Oracle that will announce as many as 450 vulnerabilities that will be fixed in the coming week. While that is true and part of the burden of security and administrator teams, the actual number of new vulnerabilities is considerably more modest, at least by Oracle standards. That gives us interesting contrast if we look at April, which was the biggest of the Fujiwara events for total vulnerabilities. But for Oracle, it gave us patches for more previously disclosed vulnerabilities than it did for new ones. So we're going to briefly go into some of the vulnerability trends, a few charts, and a little bit of discussion. Perhaps the biggest change we've seen this year is a drop in overall vulnerability disclosures. Our Q1 report showed a significant drop of 19.8% from the prior year, but that has rebounded some. At the mid-year point, we saw it was lagging behind 2019 by only 8.2%. Today, as we speak, that number is closer to 6%. So if that trend continues, we'll expect to see the 2020 numbers more in line with 2019. We may not see a big increase over the prior year like the trend shows for the previous years, but hitting around the same number as last year in the middle of a global pandemic might be expected. I say might because we, of course, do not have similar pandemic events to compare to. This is very much an outlier for us. One of the favorite questions many like to ask is, well, which vendor is worse? Worse is relative because really we have to consider that some companies have a more diverse software portfolio like Oracle, but another may have a much higher deployment like Microsoft. So they're not a very even comparison by pure vulnerability counts. That said, it is one of the things that we have to kind of do to give some perspective. So for the first half of 2020, Microsoft topped the chart with 762 vulnerabilities. That was a significant jump from last year that had less than 500 by the same point. Likewise, Oracle saw 612 the first half compared to last year, about 340. One of the vendors of particular interest is Google that came in with 563 total vulnerabilities, but let's consider why that number is so high. If we look toward the bottom of the list, we see Google Pixel and Nexus devices came in at 314. That represents about half of the vulnerabilities from them. So basically Android is seeing a significant number of disclosures, even to the point where it's more than Debian and SUSE Enterprise Server did. It's worth considering not only how fast cell phones adopted new features, but also the number of security issues they're having as well. Most of the rest of the Google vulnerabilities were seen in Chrome and the associated libraries around that. Sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Nope, there we go. Okay, sorry, we're good. So, disclosures over time. The picture of disclosures by day gives us the 7 peaks, which we might expect, except for it really should be 6 in our minds, and that's 1 for each Patch Tuesday. So, what's that 7th? In that case, we saw 2 in April, the 7th and the 14th. The first represents about 187 new disclosures, and that was due to Advantech, Google, and Mozilla all releasing on the same day, 1 week before the April Fujiwara event. So it reminds us that while Patch Tuesday is most often associated with Microsoft and Adobe and SAP and Siemens and all these other vendors, Tuesdays can also give us a lot via Oracle CPU or these other vendors if they release a little bit out of band from the rest. For many IT folks, Tuesday has become the new Monday. If we want to compare 2 operating systems just for fun, let's look at Windows 10 and OpenSUSE. So using the last chart, but we'll kind of zoom in a bit and only focus on these two. We were kind of curious what it looked like day by day for administrators of those two operating systems. And we see that the disparity is quite visible. As expected, Microsoft patches roll out once a month on schedule. So Windows administrators, they can look forward to those days with a bit of dread, but they know exactly what they're going to be dealing with. For OpenSUSE and other Linux vendors, those patches tend to roll out a few at a time. So that may mean daily patching, or depending on their policy, maybe it's weekly, or maybe they wait for the month if the severity is low for the vulnerabilities. But we can also see that OpenSUSE had 3 significant spikes, and the life of the administrator is a little bit different, that now they have to say, wait a minute, do we have to break away from our daily, weekly, monthly patch routine, and do we have to give special consideration to those? So it kind of keeps them a little bit more on their toes. It's also noteworthy is that oftentimes the Linux patches can be automated a little better, so it may not be as much of an admin burden on them. And then finally, it wouldn't be a VulnDB report or a webinar of ours without getting a quick reminder of the considerable disparity between our data and CVE. For organizations that use CVE run by MITRE, if that's your vulnerability intelligence source, you're missing out on about 3,000 vulnerabilities this year alone. It's actually higher than that, 3,000 as of the mid-year point. So about 30% of our entries do not have an associated CVE ID. But one of the other things we started noticing the past few years is we said, well, wait a minute, there are some that do have a CVE, but the CVE is in reserve status. And that means that if you go to the CVE website or NVD, that it basically just says reserved and there's no details. And that's despite the disclosure being public. So just over 3% of our vulnerabilities did have a CVE ID, but in reserve status. So really no more data for anyone using CVE as their primary source. So all in all, we just want to remind people to consider that while CVE does have one advantage, that they're free, the process behind that from start to finish is kind of rough. Has to go through CVE, then has to go through NVD, and then has to go through an analysis phase, and then it gets some metadata assigned, and that can take days, weeks, and even months sometimes. So it can be very painful lagging behind that much for an organization that does have a considerable internet footprint. And with that, we're going to open it up if you have any questions. Happy to take those, and then any discussion if it's warranted.
We actually, Brian, just had a question pop in about that last chart here, the CVE, can CVE keep up? Question is, from Anonymous, for the last chart you said there were 3,000 vulnerabilities without a CVE, but are they vulnerabilities anyone cares about?
Yeah, great question. So we do get that question when we mention the disparity. The simple answer is yes. So earlier today when I was looking through some of the data, just to refresh myself with the slides and everything, I did a quick search in our data and said, okay, show me all the vulnerabilities in the first half of this year that don't have a CVE, and just kind of skimmed through the vendors. And I saw IBM, PowerDNS, Centrion, Xerox, ManageEngine, Tivoli, SAP, and a lot of others. The big takeaway is that, yes, there are a lot of software packages that you'll never see in an enterprise organization, but additionally, there are quite a few that you will see. They are big vendors. It is enterprise software. So, yes, to that question, but not 3,000 that you have to be concerned about necessarily.
So it's more a question of understanding which of those 3,000 you should be, particularly careful.
Absolutely, and that's where we really recommend that you have an asset management system, so that as you're processing your vulnerability intelligence, wherever it comes from, that you can quickly map it to all of the assets, so that you can say, okay, well, we brought in these 5,000 vulnerabilities, but we can immediately discard 3,000 because we don't run that software. 1,000 we know for sure we do. 1,000, well, fuzzy kind of matches, we'll have to investigate those. So yeah, it's all about having the data to work with, and then your organization has to determine which of those actually apply to you.
Got it. Thank you, Brian. a few questions here. You know, people are always very interested in the top 10 vendor list. I'm sure you've noticed that. Let's snap back to that for a second here. One of the questions we have here is, I don't see Apple on the top 10 vendor list. Where do they sit in comparison?
I know the type of person that asked this question, I think. So
it's me, that type of person.
Yeah. One of the most common comparisons we see is, okay, we'll compare Microsoft and Apple, where today we compared Microsoft and OpenSys, right? So Apple actually came in, I think, at just over 150 vulnerabilities for the reporting period. So almost half of software in the public interest, which was 10th on the list. So I don't have the full list of vendors in front of me, but they were down a decent amount, far off from Microsoft's reporting period.
Do we want to talk about top products for a moment here, Brian? I think we
did I skip over that?
We did, yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought I did, and then I thought I talked about some of it. No, we did, because we talked about the Google Pixel and Nexus devices.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting is that if you compare them, is that you have Windows, essentially Linux, Windows, Linux, Android based on Linux. So those two general operating systems really dominate the top 10.
Yeah. There are still more questions coming in, so we do have a little bit of time. Let's tackle them. I think this is one that's right up your street. What are other resources besides MITRE and NVD, i.e. besides the obvious?
Yeah, so there are a few other databases out there, and what's interesting is that part of the thing that we do in addition to monitoring for vulnerabilities is we really keep tabs on the broader vulnerability ecosystem, whether it is surrounding CDE and the CDE ecosystem or the broader one. We've seen several databases essentially either close up or make some significant changes, we'll say. One example is Security Focus, run by Symantec. Last year, I think it was, they stopped updating, at least publicly, all of their database. So the BID database is no more, at least as far as a public offering. The Security database had a few remnants left. It's essentially completely gone. I think it's still offered somewhat as a private database, but I'm pretty sure they're looking, because Security is now owned by Flexera, I'm pretty sure they're looking to get out of that business. There's another public database run by IBM, the X-Force database, and while their data is good, there is no easy way to consume it, at least that I've seen. And their database exists primarily to support a lot of IBM security products, as well as a few other initiatives. So there are some other ones out there, but the two biggest things to me is, one, the broad data. You want as many vulnerabilities as you can because we want the consumer to be educated and to have all the data needed to make the best choice. And number two, actually we'll say three things. Number two is you need a way to consume that data. While some people still use the web portal and email alerting, it's not something we recommend. We actually say, no, let's go to the API. We want you to pull the data down. We want you to pull it into a system that is designed to process this data so that you can manipulate it. You can match it up to your asset inventory, map it to your vulnerability scans or whatever. And then I guess the third thing that's becoming more and more key is the metadata surrounding it. Because we can know the title, we can know the summary, we can know maybe the products affected, but having additional metadata makes a big difference in that you want to be able to say, well, wait a minute, we have 500 vulnerabilities we have to process in one day on this, April 14th. How do we really start to dig into this first and to begin to triage this? Well, one of the things you can do is say, well, okay, first off, show me all the ones that have a patch. What are the ones that we can quickly act on? Number two, you could say, well, show me all the ones that have a public exploit, because we think those are going to be much higher risk, obviously, than the ones that don't. And then you could turn your attention to those. And then you could say, well, show me the ones that have a proof of concept, or there's an exploit, but it's private, meaning it might be part of a commercial framework, or we know it's in the hands of the people that discovered it or whatnot. So that kind of metadata makes it a lot more efficient and intuitive to quickly process the information and triage for your organization and tailor that to your specific shop.
Yeah, fantastic. And of course, the sales team here will kill me if I do not say those features can be found in Vulnerability, and we would love to give you a demo of that platform, so please get in touch. It is the most comprehensive source of vulnerability intelligence available. Here is another question, Brian. This is a pushback on the Fujiwara here. And a few people have commented on the Fujiwara, actually. The comment here, I'm kind of abridging a couple, join them together, but the comment here is, if we're not expecting another Fujiwara till, I think you said 2025, why do we care?
So we care because, first off, the Fujiwara, yes, they are pretty distinct events. We can predict them because the vendors announce their patch dates. But reading between the lines, if we jump back to the disclosures over time, and you notice how I said there were 7 spikes. Well, one of those had nothing to do with Fujiwara. That was 3 vendors that disclosed on a Tuesday, and if they had coincided with the Fujiwara, we would have seen almost 700 vulnerabilities, right? And so normal patch, and the normal patch Tuesday, we know that that's Microsoft, Oracle, Siemens, SAP. There's 2 other vendors that can reliably release, and then we also have 6 optional ones, and that's your Chrome, your Mozilla, Apple, Cisco, Juniper, F5. And part of it is not just the fact that, well, let's say Cisco released 5 advisories on that day, is that might be a whole lot of routers in your shop, right? Or F5 or whatever. Or if you find yourself having to upgrade all of your Apple iOS and Mac OS devices, right? So at any given time, any one of those Tuesdays can very easily mimic a small Fujiwara. And so the other trend that we're seeing is that Microsoft, and it's a pretty distinct trend from last year is that the amount of disclosures from Microsoft alone have increased. Oracle, slowly, steadily climbing. And as these vendors, especially these big ones like Cisco, which has like 28 business units, as they acquire more shops, more companies, and fold more of that software and the hardware into their PCERT process, we are going to see more and more advisories from them. And if they decide, well, we're going to keep doing them on Tuesday because that's the right day to do it for us, then it's going to become an increased burden on admins. And that Fujiwara thing is really just going to become the norm above and beyond just a patch Tuesday.
Yep.
And that's a great question.
Great point. Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of discussion around this, the true cost of doing the vulnerability research in-house. And the reality seems to be now, you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but the reality seems to be now that as we see these enormous spikes and this increased volume of disclosures and advisories and so on, you either need to increase your investment in in-house research to match, or you need to tolerate the fact that you're going to have longer timelines for remediation, that you're not going to be able to patch everything that needs patching. And it's a really stupid question, but are you getting the sense that companies are increasing their investment in research? It feels like a very bad time to be doing that.
Yeah, so we know earlier this year, generally speaking, that many technology shops did lay off as many as 10-15% of their staff. We do know that sometimes the security team was hit. So one of my recommendations is that, look, I understand the concept of budgets. I understand the concept of trying to be proactive to, account for the pandemic, and we're still not out of this, and companies are still kind of, figuring this out as they go. But the incident response team is one that needs to be maintained at least at last year's volumes, if not slowly increased, to better match the amount of disclosures. Or if you don't want to commit an extra body or two to that team, is to have some flex people, someone that you can pull from another team that on Tuesdays, they come over and sit with the IR people and get to help triage all those vulnerabilities that come in.
Absolutely. Yep. And where you can't do it in-house, of course, we have our own team of professional researchers who would love to help you with that. Please do get in touch. I think, Brian, that takes us to the end. We have addressed most of the questions. Thank you for so many good questions today. Really appreciate that. That makes this discussion much more interesting for all of us, I think. So thank you to everyone who asked questions, and I hope we answered them satisfactorily.
And
let me just...
Real quick, for those that will be watching this after on the recording, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Brendan directly. He will be answering all of the mails to start, and I will work with them to answer any of your questions about vulnerabilities. Yeah, and that's the best way to throw marketing under the bus.
Thanks a bunch. Thanks a bunch. And my email address is brian@riskbasesecurity.com. So let me thank everyone again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Brian, for your insights here. Please go to that RBS channel on BrightTALK and mash that subscribe button. We will be back with you looking at Q3 trends for data breaches and vulnerabilities in no time at all. Until then, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, or wherever you are in the world. And goodbye for now.
Thank you.